What is the difference between elaborate DIY coffee setups versus someone just taking a tin of instant coffee and drinking that?
It's a reconstituted cup of coffee. They will historically sort of harvest some of the aroma and inject that under the foil lid so that when you pop the thing open, it smells pretty good. That's not in the sort of ground granules that you'll work with. That was just put there to give you that moment of like, oh, nice.
Is there a way, or I'm not even condoning what I'm about to suggest, is there any difference in human fermented coffee?
I gather someone in Portland or Oregon has tried, but I don't know, and I'm not sure I'd be willing to try.
What are some things that can lead you down the path of picking a really good cup of coffee?
I mean, coffee's difficult because...
Well, James, I've been watching you for a very long time on YouTube, so, it's fantastic to have you, joining me here, and hopefully one day I can join you for a nice, well-brewed cup of coffee as well.
That sounds good. I would be delighted to.
And I really think coffee has had a fantastic makeover in recent years, because when I was growing up in the 90s, coffee was seen as a vice alongside cigarettes and alcohol.
Sure.
Often it would be portrayed as something nefarious. But in the last 10 years or so, in popular media, it's now been touted as a health food, a superfood, and which it rightly is. It contains lots of fantastic things. How has that been made to be a thing where it's just gone from something seemingly so bad to something so healthy, and the pendulum has swung almost the complete other way now?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, coffee itself has changed. In the 90s, I think coffee was broadly considered a necessary evil in many ways. Like, it was not a source of pleasure or delight in people's lives. It was a source of a good, cheap stimulant. First thing in the morning, came out of a jar. It was instant. It was quick, and it got you going. However, that phrase works for you. I think in the last 20 years, really, we've had the rise of what is broadly termed specialty coffee, right? Which is coffee that is sold at a premium price because it tastes nicer. Ultimately, that's the easiest, neatest definition of it. And so I think people have started to ultimately enjoy coffee more. It tastes better than it ever has before. It's easier to get something that has all of the flavor and just less of the bitterness, less of the harshness, less of the woodiness, all of those kind of things. And so our consumption has changed quite dramatically. In the UK specifically, we were very, very heavy instant coffee drinkers, and, not that much of it. Coffee slowly crept up as this out-of-home drink. In the sort of late 90s, as sort of Starbucks and the chains arrived, we got into the idea of going out for coffee. And then in the early 2000s, it kind of really kicks off. And I would say from the late... sort of 2008 to 2010 is when the sort of surge of specialty begins in most of the UK and most of the world, really. Now the UK drinks more coffee than tea, which I think is fascinating. And, an interesting point of, I suppose, national identity for us. Tea has always been an at-home thing, and I think coffee dominated out of home. We don't really like people to make tea for us unless it's a family member. We don't want to spend money at a cafe for a cup of tea that we know costs 10p, and we can do it better ourselves. So we've always been a bit hesitant about spending money on tea out of home. But coffee, certainly post-pandemic, became very big in-home as well. We brought that into our lives, and that's why we've become this sort of slightly more coffee than tea kind of culture. As for the health stuff, it's an interesting one. Like, obviously, coffee's been studied heavily. Caffeine itself, it's also worth separating at this point. Caffeine is not coffee. Like, it's one aspect of coffee. It's the drug that we're most familiar with, but it's not the entirety of coffee's interesting chemistry. And I think more recently we've begun to get more interested in the other sort of aspects of why coffee may be healthy. You know what I mean? If you look at the big kind of epidemiology studies with the sort of biobank stuff, coffee was an easy thing to sort of track. And I think, people quite early began to see these sort of trends with positive associations with coffee drinking. And I think we've started to investigate that a little bit more now to try and understand, is there actually something there?
Yeah, I guess, that was one point you made about people often wrongly use the word caffeine and coffee interchangeably. And as you mentioned, it's one component of something, that has a multitude of different beneficial compounds. And just diving into some of those health benefits you're listing and those large epidemiological associations, it's been now seen that there's some good positive health associations with gut health, metabolic health, heart health, obviously as some sort of psychoactive component to it as well, potentially brain health, certainly from alertness and focus point of view. What is it about those other compounds? Is it primarily, can we attribute them to the polyphenols, or is there something else to it as well, almost from a ritualistic point of view, which helps with those other things?
It's a very good question. I feel compelled, having been corrected on this myself, to sort of say that coffee has no polyphenols. It has phenolic compounds, but no polyphenols. I don't really deeply understand the difference between those two things, but scientists in the area would want me to get it right and have emailed me to make sure that I do when I talk about these things. So, yeah, I think we're starting to see some more data around the phenolic stuff, the fiber in coffee, ultimately the gut health association. Which is good news if, because caffeine isn't all good news for everybody. There's obviously, for some people, it can exacerbate anxiety or other issues. And so caffeine should be off the table for some people. If it disrupts your sleep, it should absolutely be off the table. I think we now understand sleep is probably more important than we have previously considered. As for health, at the moment, there's outside of I think the most recent study I've seen was one that Dr. Tim Spector was involved with, which identified a particular bacteria that is found in the guts of coffee drinkers. And I think it's a Lawsonobacter asaccharide. It doesn't eat sugar. I can't remember that.
Yeah.
Thank you very much. That's interesting because I think that's the first time there's almost a perfect correlation between a food and a singular bacteria. And that's a butyrate producing bacteria. So in theory, maybe that's a kind of pathway of goodness. I'm very hesitant to talk with any confidence or certainty in a lot of health stuff, but especially microbial stuff, where we don't really know what a good, healthy gut is.
Exactly.
We you know what I mean? And so a lot of people will say, oh, it damages your gut microbiome. Well, it changes it, but we don't have a gold standard of like, this is good. And so it's an area I get quite nervous around. And, with coffee and epidemiology, I also get quite nervous around that sort of stuff. There was a study, I think, recently that talked about how people who drank coffee later in the day had worse outcomes. And so there was an association between sort of late coffee drinking and various worse outcomes from, I think, some biobank data. Someone had done a little study on this. I worry about that because it doesn't really ask the question of who might be drinking coffee later in the day. What might be leading to them drinking coffee later in the day? Are they working a job that requires a lot of focus? Are they in a stressful environment? Is it the coffee, or is coffee just a kind of byproduct of underlying cause? But you can take that data and say, ooh, if you drink coffee later in the day, there are worse health outcomes. And you're like, well, that may not be true. And that's the bit with epidemiology that makes me very nervous, I think. It's just easy to draw associations without really digging into the why of the association.
Yeah, I agree. I think there are loose associations. I mean, we can say that the phenolic compounds maybe select for certain bacteria, which may then provide a certain benefit. The coffee or coffee beans contain soluble fibers and prebiotic fibers, which we know in broad strokes are good for gut health. However, people with certain gut conditions or gut sensitivities, it may not be so good for them and provide bloating and cramping. And I guess, we can make broad claims on coffee in general. And this is where I really wanted to dive in. So, we can talk about fruits being healthy in general and plants and vegetables being healthy. Coffee beans are derived, obviously, it's a plant-based food. And it would be doing coffee a disservice if we, labeled all coffee the same. And the same way that if you eat an orange, you can get a different nutrient profile than if you eat an apple. Similarly, I would like to say, and you can correct me if I'm wrong here, that if you consume a certain type of coffee bean grown in a certain place in the world and produced in a certain way, you can get slightly different nutrients than a different type of coffee grown in a different country, exposed to different microbes.
Yeah, I think there's no question that there's some pretty significant difference in the chemical composition of different coffee beans. And the good news, I suppose, is that by and large, better tasting coffee appears to have, for want of a better term, better chemistry, if that makes sense. It has higher levels of phenolic compounds. There's a lot of sort of misinformation around mycotoxins that stresses me out quite a lot. Yeah. Mycotoxins are, in coffee, a product usually of mold. where the raw coffee has gone moldy and you can have some mycotoxin formation there. That usually happens before the coffee's roasted and goes through a fairly destructive chemical process. But nonetheless, you tend to find almost no mycotoxins in specialty coffee. But you'll see a lot of people sort of pushing, oh no, but this coffee is mycotoxin free. And you're like, well, most good coffee is mycotoxin free. But yeah, if you're drinking much, much, much cheaper coffee, yeah, your risk of mycotoxin levels might be slightly higher because those coffees may be subject to mold because no one really cares about the quality of them. They're just a commoditized product.
So those mycotoxins, those sort of dangerous byproducts from fungal infestation potentially, are they potentially present in larger amounts, or the risk of them being present in larger amounts higher in certain countries? For example, you can have coffee beans that are grown in higher altitude versus lower altitude. Lower altitude means maybe more insects. Does that increase the risk of mycotoxin formation, moisture formation, which can increase the risk of that, etc.?
No, that's not the correlation there. It's complicated here. I'm going to separate altitude just quickly, but ultimately, mold formation is going to happen post-harvest. There's a few post-harvest processes that the coffee seed goes through. And then ultimately, once it's sort of finished post-harvest processing, during export, potentially, there's your sort of risk. If it's not kept in a suitable environment, if it's kept in a humid environment, that's where you may have mold formation and sort of lower quality things. Anyone buying higher quality product would reject anything with any presence of mold in it because it would fall below, the contracted standard for sort of cup quality and raw bean quality. Altitude is interesting because altitude broadly correlates to quality in coffee. So the higher you grow coffee, generally speaking, the higher quality it is. Interestingly, you see a little bit less caffeine production in higher altitudes because there are less insects, and caffeine exists in the coffee plant as an insect repellent.
Oh.
That's its primary function. Yeah, it's a defense chemical. It exists in other plants for different reasons. I think you've seen I don't know if you've seen the studies on certain flowers produce caffeine, and it appears to improve memory in bees, which is a lovely sort of idea and story.
To improve pollination?
Mm-hmm, that's the sort of theory of why that may be the case.
Wow.
Though I think that caffeine, as I recall, it's the same compound but evolved through different pathways, if that makes sense. So
can we harvest any of these other flowers that contain caffeine?
I think by and large plants don't like it when you harvest the flowers because obviously that interrupts the sort of the pollination, the fruiting, all the rest of it. And so we could, but we would obviously damage the tree's fruiting potentially. It depends what the tree is. I think it's orange blossom off the top of my head produces caffeine in the flowers, but I may be wrong on that one there. Caffeine obviously exists in things like tea leaves, and you can harvest it there. Synthetic caffeine is now entirely possible. China is producing synthetic caffeine, which has sort of interesting talking to decaffeinators who obviously collect the caffeine and sell it. The price of caffeine has been sort of deeply undercut by synthetic caffeine. And so generally speaking, people buying caffeine that has come from coffee or tea will label it as natural caffeine. If it just says caffeine, it may well be synthetic. Obviously, always important to note that synthetic caffeine and natural caffeine are entirely identical, and your body can tell no difference between the two things. But there's no, to me, it's just interesting that people value natural caffeine higher in a funny sort of way. Anyway, going all the way back to altitude, what coffee trees like is lots of sunshine, but cool nights. That's the sort of thing. You want the diurnal swing. So lots of warm sunshine in the day, feed the plant, but cool nights slow down maturation. So you end up with a denser seed at the center of this thing. And so that's why you tend to see higher quality coffees that are denser, have more interesting chemistry, a lot more acids in them too, which some people don't like. Some people do. You tend to find a lot more complexity of ultimately aroma in the finished coffee bean from these higher altitude coffees, less earthiness, less woodiness, typically a little bit more sweetness. And so altitude is a reasonably good proxy for quality, but not a perfect one.
So when you say altitude, we're thinking of South America, Colombia, East Africa, Kenya, Ethiopia. Mm-hmm. Are those sort of the countries where you get high altitude coffee beans grown?
Essentially, the belt of coffee growing is the Tropic of Cancer down to the Tropic of Capricorn. So that belt around the Earth, anything there with sufficient altitude, or in the case of island coffees, a sort of matching swing between daytime and nighttime. So Yeah, you tend to see coffees in places like Jamaica, Cuba, Hawaii, but you still can have high quality coffees produced at these lower altitudes because you tend to see bigger temperature drops at night. I assume that the cooling sea air comes in and just drops temperatures. So you have a sort of matching swing day to night. So it's not a perfect proxy. And again, there are, because it's ultimately tied to climate as much as anything else, it's not a hard and fast rule of like anything grown at 1,500 meters will be excellent, anything grown at 1,200 meters will be terrible, or 800 meters or whatever else. Islands can be down at 500 meters, whereas if you bought a coffee from, say, Brazil at 500 meters, that would tend to taste much worse than an island coffee. So slightly confusing, but broadly speaking, altitude's a pretty good proxy for some sort of quality.
So those higher altitude coffee beans, they're called Arabica beans. Is that generally what's attributed to high altitude?
So Arabica is a species of coffee. We grow commercially mostly 2 species. There are maybe 2, 3, 4 others that are of potential interest, but almost all of the world's coffee is Arabica or Robusta.
Okay.
About 2/3 Arabica, about 1/3 Robusta, though it's increasingly Robusta, so it's probably 60-40 these days. Arabica is a plant that needs higher altitudes to flourish. So it's not particularly hardy as plants go. If you grow it at lower altitudes, it will suffer from insect damage, or it will just fail to yield well. It won't taste particularly good. The other species, which would be Coffea canephora, is mostly known as Robusta. That was the name the Belgians gave it because it was this hardier plant that would grow at these lower altitudes. Certain countries tend to grow more of that if they don't have higher altitudes. Vietnam's a very big producer of Robusta. Brazil produces quite a lot of Robusta too, but also a lot of Arabica. It's the biggest producer of coffee in the world. But these are the 2 main species. Robusta produces about twice the caffeine content of Arabica. Again, it just needs more defense chemical because it's grown in an environment where it needs more defenses. It's more disease resistant. There's a few kind of key diseases that are a problem in coffee growing. But to most people, it has taste characteristics that they would consider less desirable than Arabica. Robusta tends to taste a little rubbery, earthy, woody, whereas Arabica tends not to have those kind of key characteristics to it. And obviously, you can roast it so it's very bitter, but it has a lower sort of intrinsic bitterness to it, which people prefer, and a sort of higher capacity for complexity.
So beyond the difference in caffeine content, with Robusta generally having a much higher caffeine content because, I guess, for this insect repellent environment it needs to flourish in, is there also another difference in the amount of phenolic compounds? Can we say that those Arabica have higher levels of phenolic compounds? And is there a reason for that?
I believe it does have higher levels of phenolic compounds. Fiber-wise, I'm not sure if there'd be much difference. I have read the papers, but I cannot remember off the top of my head. Ultimately, Arabica seeds are much denser. So there's a lot more inside each seed, if that makes sense. And so that's typically why bean for bean, you would see higher levels. Outside of that, I don't know enough about the pathways that sort of generate the phenolic compounds to say that with any certainty. But again, if you go all the way back to, say, the Leucinobacter, there are some key acids that does seem to metabolize. And so one of those is quinic acid, and you tend to see higher levels of quinic acid in Arabica coffee than you would do in Robusta. But aside from that, most of the time, most of the decision-making for a consumer is around taste, and most of the decision-making for a coffee producer is really about yield, like what will give me the best crop in this environment. And sometimes there's a bit of a disconnect, as I think everyone presumes it's like wine, where every producer is thinking about the end bottle and how will that taste. Most producers are thinking, how will I, with the least risk, get the highest return from this land with this crop?
I mean, when you're talking about taste as well, obviously the Robusta versus Arabica or whatever other bean you choose will have an impact. The next impact, I guess, will also come depending on how it's roasted, whether it's a dark roast, a light roast, or a medium roast. What impact does that also then have on its sort of nutritional value as well? Because clearly, if you're exposing beans to heat, there will be some degradation of some of these beneficial compounds. But then on the other foot, you might get an increase of other beneficial compounds.
Yes, it's a tricky one. By and large, the darker you roast something, the less there is in terms of its chemistry. There is a lot of degradation, a lot of breakdown from heat, formation of new compounds. A bunch of stuff will ultimately turn to smoke and disappear off out of it. That doesn't mean that there's nothing of value in darker roasted coffees, but I think for things like phenolic compounds, there's a little bit more in lighter roasted coffees. The tricky bit is that the lighter the roast, the harder they are to extract properly in the kind of brewing process. But I don't think that's really a concern meaningfully. When it comes to coffee, I think it's worth just highlighting at this point. Drinking coffee you enjoy is going to be key, ultimately. Like chasing health benefits through drinking coffee you don't enjoy, I don't think the return is there, if that makes sense. Like forcing yourself to drink light roast if you like medium roast, forcing yourself to drink high-grown coffees if you just don't like acidity in coffee. I don't think the juice is worth the squeeze, if that makes sense. Like it's something that should be a delight. I think there's value in just enjoying something. And I think the benefits from things like fiber or even phenolic compounds don't vary enough that just drinking coffee you like regularly without it impacting sleep, that's it. That's the value in a funny sort of way. I don't think it's worth optimizing for health over optimizing for delight.
Like with wine or with chocolate, for example, or any cocoa product, because of those different aromatase chemicals, those phenolic compounds, the longer you savor something, the different profiles you get. And, as with chocolate, if you let it linger in your mouth and melt in your mouth, you slowly get the different tones and the profiles. I guess with coffee, it would be a similar thing as well. Most of us would probably be guilty of just chugging a coffee down, knocking it back, within a few gulps, or not really taking the time to, I guess the word is slurp it and really spray all those, that liquid in the back of your mouth so you can really get those different notes. What's the best way to actually taste your coffee if you were focused on getting that, real kind of professional taste?
It's a good question. It's tricky. So yes, on one level, slurping is part of it. That aspiration, sort of not aspiration, but like spraying of, I don't aspirate the coffee, spraying of coffee into the sort of mouth does sort of turn up the volume and flavor a little bit. The real hack is comparison. It's quite easy to do with coffee, with chocolate. It's reasonably easy to do with wine. Coffee, it's something that people don't often get to do, but it's the secret. And so just taking two different coffees and brewing a cup of each and sharing that with someone else, half a cup each kind of thing, bouncing between the two, as you learn to compare and contrast, that will build your sense of understanding of flavor, of taste, of preference faster than anything else. And so that's the secret. That's it. Because to taste something on its own is really hard to say, well, how much sweetness do I get here? Compared to what? You know what I mean? How much acidity am I experiencing compared to what? How much aroma? What does it taste? What does it remind me of? How is it different to what? Whereas if you have a point of contrast, you can work your way through slowly. Is it sweeter? Is it less sweet? Does it have more texture and mouthfeel? Does it have less? Do I like that it has more or less? What does it remind me of? Does it remind me of fruit? Does this one not remind me of fruit? If it is fruit, what kind of fruit does it remind me of? Like it's that contrast that is essential, and that's sort of the quickest way to build language, to build understanding, and to build preference.
Now, I've seen an increased number of people, probably following in your footsteps, trying to do all these sort of elaborate DIY coffee setups at home. I see them, boundless videos of them on, YouTube, on Instagram, on TikTok, people having these beautiful contraptions at home and they're grinding these things and they've got these special filter cups. And for me, it just looks like alchemy and it's just amazing to watch. And I don't understand it. What is the difference in layman's terms between that sort of very professional, cool looking setup versus someone just taking a tin of instant coffee or just some beans or an espresso machine with a little pod and drinking that?
I mean, Nespresso, we'll get to Nespresso. Instant is worth just sort of hiving off to one side because it is almost worth thinking about this as it's a reconstituted cup of coffee. So at some point, some months ago, an incredibly strong cup of coffee was brewed in these strange sort of giant pillars of coffee extraction. And an instant coffee manufacturer will do some interesting things to break down the ground coffee even further so that they can extract some of the things that you usually can't extract. And they'll take that incredibly strong brew and freeze dry it or spray dry it. And so what you end up with is all the soluble material from some pretty cheap coffee, including the stuff that doesn't taste of anything and is just sort of broken down, usually insoluble material in a coffee bean. That then sits in a jar for some months, and then you then reconstitute that into a cup of coffee later. Because it's sort of bulked out by these products that they break down, so they hydrolyze some of the stuff in coffee that you usually can't extract. That has no flavor, that has no nutritional value, whatever else. It sort of means that you're sort of brewing a cup with half of nothing and then half of coffee, if that makes sense. So things like caffeine levels are surprisingly low, considering it's made from Robusta usually. Things like the phenolic compound levels are pretty low because, gram for gram, it has come from less coffee beans.
So it's basically anhydrous coffee.
Some of it is. Some of it's proper coffee extract, and some of it is just other stuff too, which adds very little except bulks the product out effectively. They will historically sort of harvest some of the aroma and inject that under the foil lid so that when you pop the thing open, it smells pretty good, making you feel like, oh, this is coffee. It smells good. It smells nice. That's not in the sort of ground granules that you'll work with. That was just put there to give you that moment of like, oh, nice.
But it has some health benefits still.
Yes, it's some. But I mean, it is, you tend to find people who drink instant drink a lot more of it, I think because it has less caffeine, because it has less sort of everything in it, which is interesting. A lot of people who switch from instant to proper coffee find themselves drinking less coffee, which is interesting. It's just a sort of natural, like, oh, I just need less of this. So there's perhaps a false economy in the cheapness of instant, but that's for another day. Nespresso came in and did a very good job at taking something that was complicated and quite annoying, which is making espresso, which is a sort of intense process of pumping very hot water through very finely ground coffee high pressures that allowed you to sort of get the water through the coffee, because the finer you grind coffee, the better it fits together and the more effectively it sandbags the water flowing out of the machine. So you need to push harder and harder and harder. And espresso machines push at 9 bars, which is an abstract amount of pressure to most people. It's about 130 PSI if you're interested in inflating bicycle tires, maybe. That process is finicky. Small adjustments to how you grind the coffee will have a very big impact on taste. You need a nice grinder, you need a nice machine. You need a little investment of both, resource and time and skill. And Nespresso said, what if we sold you this capsule and you just put it in a machine and pushed go and you got espresso out of it? And people were like, that sounds pretty good. And there's obviously a pretty big compromise in that. You're going to massively overpay. It's a little bit like a microwave meal is my lazy sort of explanation for it, in that it's not particularly good value. You could definitely do better yourself with a little bit of effort. But it is very easy. It's a bit of waste that goes alongside it, but it's very easy.
But it's good quality coffee, is it, from one of those machines?
It's not bad. I don't enjoy some of it, but the raw materials are kind of okay. You just don't get very much. Typically speaking, if you went to a sort of independent coffee shop and you bought a flat white, 6 ounce, 8 ounce flat white, whatever it's going to be, they'll use about 18 grams of coffee in that espresso machine to brew you what is ultimately a double espresso at the bottom of that thing. But you're kind of getting 18 grams worth of ground coffee. An espresso capsule has 5 to 5.5 grams of ground coffee in it. And so you'd need to brew 3.5 of those to sort of have a matching coffee experience in a fun sort of way. They're not thinking you're going to do that. You're going to drink a little espresso and not really think about it. But you're spending a lot of money for 5.5 grams of coffee. So that's the biggest sort of compromise is how much money you're spending on coffee that isn't, from a quality perspective, worth that much money. But you're paying for the convenience on top of that. That's the tax that you pay on top of that. And that built them an incredible business because historically espresso was annoying enough that people didn't want to do it. The pandemic changed that, and changes in technology around coffee making at home have changed. And so it's easier these days to make coffee at home, make espresso at home. And so more people are doing it. That can, like a lot of hobbies, send you down a rabbit hole where you begin, to sort of butt up against some of the Challenges, you may spend a little bit at the start and be very happy. And then you get into the hobby and be like, oh, but I need a better grinder because I want to solve this problem. And then you improve your grinder. You're like, well, a better espresso machine would, give me more control and more repeatability and those things, or let me experiment more. And so you can fall down this rabbit hole of expense, which I'm not a huge fan of, but I understand it. Thankfully, some people do just stop where they start. Get a little setup, are happy, make nice coffee, enjoy it. For me, a lot of people say, should I get an espresso machine? And I usually ask, do you want a hobby? Because espresso will quickly turn into one or frustrate you because you're not willing to let it be one.
What are the components that you're involved with? I mean, you've got this machine, and am I right in thinking the machine is similar to one that you'd find in one of these independent coffee stores? What, just like a smaller scale at home, what is it that you are doing to kind of remove the automaticity of it and the manual component that you're adding to it?
So in an espresso machine, you'll see people, they'll grab handles and load them in and out machines. And these handles have little baskets inside, and inside the basket is where you put your coffee to be extracted. Now, that coffee, very small changes in how you grind that coffee will change the way the espresso brews. And small changes in the way it brews has big impacts on taste. So the phrase you tend to see amongst coffee enthusiasts is called dialing in, where you kind of get the grind just right to get the flow that you want. The machine will offer constant temperature and constant pressure. And so the resistance that the coffee gives the machine determines how quickly the brew happens. If you go to a coffee shop and you see the sort of coffee just gushing out of the handles very, very quickly, it's probably not going to taste good. The contact time is too little. The coffee's probably too coarse. It won't have pulled out all the flavor that you want. Generally speaking, most people are brewing between 20 and 30 seconds to get that espresso brewed. Faster than that can often be very sour and empty and unpleasant. Slower than that can often be unpleasant in different ways. I don't want to set hard and fast rules, but this is a sort of window that you're looking for. Better grinders do a better job, or more expensive grinders, I suppose, of producing more uniform pieces of ground coffee. A lot of people will start with a blade grinder, they're called. You put the coffee in the top, put a lid on, you push a button, and a sort of blade spins aggressively. That will smash the coffee into a variety of pieces. Some will be incredibly sort of fine, and some will be quite large. The fine ones will give up their flavor almost instantly and start to give you things you don't want. The very large pieces just won't give up much flavor because you're not really getting to the inside of them, and they'll tend to add some sourness. So you get a lot of bitterness from the tiny pieces, some sourness from the big pieces, and you have this sour, bitter, not great tasting brew. Better grinders use burrs, sort of cutting discs that you control the distance of them. So there's two circular discs usually, and your adjustment mechanism, usually threading, will let you move them closer or further apart. And it's a matter of microns here. Like it might be 10, 20, 30 micron adjustments. So tiny adjustments, but that'll have a really big impact on taste. And so the things you learn are what we call poke prep, where you learn to grind correctly, put the right amount in, make sure it's even before you compress it, and then brew, taste, and adjust again if needed. So that kind of process, for some people, it's very satisfying and enjoying. For others, noisy, messy, and not worth the trouble. And paying £2-3 to a local coffee shop seems good value.
So if you are going to your local coffee shop to, get some coffee or whatever, these independent stores, is there any red flags that you should be looking for in terms of the setup, how quickly they brew the coffee, the type of coffee beans they're using? You can get a quick read of the quality just by going somewhere. There
are some clear red flags. There's some big red flags you should look out for. The most obvious one would be the steam wand that they use to steam the milk. If you see milk accumulating on that in any way, it's not dangerous. That steam wand will get up to like 110 degrees Celsius, so it's pasteurized, it's safe. It's just slightly disgusting and disappointing and shows a lack of care, attention, and training in that particular business. If you see the coffee kind of gushing out of those handles, you want to see it fall and look almost like honey. That's the ideal. It should just sort of drip down nicely. If it sort of gushes out, that may not be the best coffee of your life, so to speak. And then you just want to watch the area around the grinder. Are they clean? Are they neat? Is it a terrible, chaotic mess of ground coffee? Again, it'll give you some insight into how good the training's been, what the standards are like in that cafe. Beyond that, hard to say. You can usually see the coffee beans in a hopper. And so if you know you don't like very dark roasts, if you see that there, you're not going to have a good time. If you know you don't like very light roasts, if you see that the coffee beans look very light colored, there is some clue there. But beyond that, it's a little bit of the luck of the draw. Better cafes are ultimately more consistent cafes. They're more reliable cafes. It's not necessarily that the best coffee is the best of your life. It's they'll never serve you anything disappointing. It'll always be, pretty good. That's, for me, the sign of a truly great cafe is that they're never disappointing, rather than once in a blue moon, they blow my socks off.
I mean, to elaborate on that point, where in the world do you feel is the greatest abundance of good coffee shops? Is it the sort of cliche France, Italy, or is there somewhere else that is not on the map yet, but actually that's where you should go for a bit of coffee tourism?
These days, most major cities are pretty safe bets. London is an incredible hub of coffee. New York, LA, I'm trying to think Bogota, Madrid. Obviously these cultures like Australia, New Zealand that have made good coffee a part of like cafe culture. And yes, you're likely to have a good cafe experience there in a way you may not in other places. So, that's one. But, China, Japan, Saudi Arabia, a lot of the countries all over the world are having big coffee booms around specialty coffee. And so in major cities, it's easier than ever to drink great coffee.
What makes a coffee a specialty coffee? Is it something about the way the bean is actually processed?
It's a tricky one because it's difficult to really have a neat definition for. You can have a industry standard for the raw coffee in that it must have no significant defects in a sample size and these kind of things. My feeling has always been it's kind of cultural to some extent. It's what people will pay a premium for, right? That's really the truly defining characteristic. To that culture, to that community, it tastes better. And so there are coffees that I really don't like that some people would say are specialty coffees because they value them more. Broadly, these coffees are produced with taste in mind, I think a little bit more. So coffee trees don't ripen uniformly. And so you can choose to pick all the fruit at once and deal with it, or you can choose to revisit a tree a number of times to sort of pick at peak ripeness. Generally speaking, specialty coffees are picked when they are riper or are more uniformly ripe, as an example. They'll have been processed with a little bit more care and investment in them. So once you pick a coffee cherry, very quickly you need to process it. The reason we don't tend to see coffee fruit anywhere is one, there's not a lot of fruit in the fruit. It's mostly seed. And two, it degrades pretty quick. And so you want to process it relatively quickly. Three main ways to do that. You can squeeze the seed out. You can ferment it a little bit to help break down any of the sticky kind of fruit still clinging to it, and then wash that off and then dry that seed down. And that's called washed, the wash process. You can take the whole cherry, and if you have limited access to water, you could choose to just dry that fruit in the sun. Dry it down completely. That's called the natural or dry process. It historically was used in areas with limited access to water and was used on lower quality coffees because it's the cheapest of the processes. There's nothing but the sun is added to it. It can be done very well, or it can be done not as well. You can leave a whole piece of fruit in the sun and have a good outcome of nice dried fruit, or a less good outcome of some fermenting that you maybe don't want going on there. In the middle, there's a few processes that have similar sort of names, similar processes but slightly different names, where you might squeeze the seed out and then dry it still covered in a little bit of its sort of fruit flesh, for want of a better term. That might be called a pulped natural or a honey process. There are differences within these, but perhaps not for this conversation to go too deep into that. The processes will have an impact on taste. And so you'll see in most specialty coffee that will be listed on the bag. It will say this is a washed coffee, this is a natural or a dry processed coffee, this is a pulp natural, whatever it is, because it has an impact. Washed coffees tend to have broadly slightly higher acidity. Naturally processed coffees can have more of those kind of fermented fruit flavors. They can be a little bit funky or kind of tropical tasting. Some people really like that because it's unusual and it's fun and this very fruity kind of wild cup of coffee. Other people really deeply dislike that. It's a bit of cultural variance, But it's one of those things that as you learn your preferences, you'll learn, do I like natural processed coffees or not? And then it becomes a very useful guide of, if I buy this bag, will I have a nice time? So that's kind of important to think about.
One of these strange coffees that I read about a few years ago was Kopi Luwak. And, it's sort of the coffee beans, or the coffee cherries eaten by these, civets, this cat-like mammal, which you obviously already know. And then it essentially excretes the seed and digests the fruit component of it. These seeds in the feces are extracted, and then, it's like a pre-fermented coffee bean, and then that's sold for ludicrous prices. I mean, is that actually a high quality coffee? And are we seeing more of these really wild, crazy coffees in the way they're extracted and processed?
Kopi Luwak is a difficult one. I'm a hater. Let's go with that. Go with that. I'll give you the why. I mean, the story is funny enough in that it came from a time when the Dutch colonials were sort of dominantly controlling coffee production in Indonesia, and obviously wouldn't allow the locals to consume coffee because they wanted the coffee for export. The locals worked out that these cats were eating some of the fruit, and you could, if you found the seeds in the feces, you could wash them off and you could have some coffee. And to them, they thought it tasted pretty good, and the Dutch were like, well, we'll have that too, please. The more depressing aspect is that as that has grown in notoriety and popularity, unsurprisingly, the response has been to catch and cage civets and force feed them. And so you have a number of problems these days. Everyone will tell you that theirs is free-range Kopi Luwak, even though I would say the majority of Kopi Luwak is from caged sort of people indulging in animal cruelty. More than that, because people have sort of an openness to how it might taste and an expectation of terribleness, just a vast amount of it is forged. It's just low-quality coffee. And you're like, oh, this tastes terrible. And you're like, well, it did come out of a civet, and you're not surprised, and you've had this experience or whatever else. And so while, theoretically wild Kopi Luwak exists, I would have, I could go hunting for it, and unless I collected it myself, which I'm not going to do, but that would be the only way I would have confidence that it was wild. You just don't know, and the chances are it's probably caged or it's probably forged. And so from my point of view, I cannot recommend this to people because even if the taste was fantastic, the cost is simply too high. You'll see similar things. You can see elephant processed coffee. I've seen bird processed coffee. For me, it's just, I don't think promoting these tends to lead to good outcomes or ones that I'm particularly happy to see happen, if that makes sense.
I mean, not that I'm condoning the sort of consumption of this civet fermented coffee, but is there a way, or I'm not even condoning what I'm about to suggest, is there any difference in human fermented coffee? What if that was recycled? Would it have a similar impact where those sort of coffee seeds are pre-fermented by the human microbiome?
I gather someone in Portland or Oregon has tried, but I don't know, and I'm not sure I'd be willing to try. I mean, we don't know. I have seen one, maybe two companies do some specific microbial biology on sort of additional fermentations to try and mimic Kopi Luwak in an ethical way. I just don't really know what the changes are and if they're that interesting. I suspect there's just some degradation of the proteins in there. There's some breakdown. Obviously, seeds have evolved to be pretty resilient to stomachs. That's the whole point of a seed in fruit. So, I don't think this vast change is happening there because that sort of defeats the purpose of a seed in fruit. I think there's other opportunities to experiment with fermentation without ethical concerns that can result in some really interesting flavors. And you're seeing that now in coffee. There's a lot of work being done, a lot of experimentation around fermentation for flavor that's producing some very, very unusual, interesting coffees.
I mean, if one were to support ethical sourcing of coffee beans, are labels like Fair Trade or Rainforest Alliance legitimate ways to, I guess, give credence to something that's ethically sourced and produced?
That's a very difficult question. I think what you define as ethical is sort of up to you in this one. I think it's worth understanding what certifications actually offer, because generally speaking, we don't, and we would like a shortcut. And I understand that. Most people don't have time to dive into, well, what exactly does fair trade offer? And as an example, fair trade in most of the world, there's some variances on fair trade and fair trade and fairly traded and other things, typically there'd be a small premium above market price for the coffee. Not a significant premium, but a premium nonetheless. In the UK, I think in most of the US, fair trade coffee can only come from a cooperative of coffee growers. It cannot come from a single estate. And so I don't think people understand that, you can't have all coffee be fair trade because it can only apply theoretically to cooperatives of growers, as an example. Typically speaking, there's nothing built in around quality into most of the certifications. That's sort of something that's considered outside of their realm. And some will have some auditing around farm practices or sort of human rights. Others won't. I mean, coffee's difficult because, and I'm someone who has worked in this industry for 20 years. I struggle with this. It was built, coffee, production, the economics of it was built to be unfair. That was baked in from the beginning. You know what I mean? Coffee is grown in so many countries because colonial powers took it there and forced it to be grown so that they could, exploit the cheap land, cheap labor, and enjoy the product back in their home countries. That was the system that was built. It was, as much as we don't want it to be the case, it is still the system and structure that we work within today. How coffee is traded hasn't really changed in 100 years. People are trying to spend more money on it, but ultimately they're trying to do better within a pretty broken system. And that's difficult, ultimately. I don't have a good answer or solution to that one. And yes, spending more money on coffee generally means that if the coffee has a farmer's name on it or a producer's or a cooperative's name on it, or there's some real traceability behind it, chances are more of your money is going to that coffee producer or those producers. Is it enough? That's a complicated question. But it is, by and large, I think, as much as altitude is a proxy for quality, traceability is a pretty good proxy for ethics.
So I guess to dig into that more, if you were in the supermarket on the hunt for a good quality coffee, what things should you look for in the back of the coffee packet when you're looking at the ingredients list or just on the packet? What are some things that can lead you down the path of picking a really good cup of coffee?
In an ideal world, you'd want a roasted on date. Generally speaking, this will immediately tell you if it's a specialty coffee or not, because most commercially produced coffee will not have a roasted on date. It will have a best before date. Coffee is food safe for a really long time. Packaged, it's food safe for years and years. Pre-ground, it's not fresh and it's not particularly delicious, but it is definitely food safe. So you'll tend to see on most sort of cheaper coffees a use-by date that would be anywhere from 18 to 24 months from the date that it was roasted. Specialty coffee will usually give you a roasted on date, and then say anywhere from 1 month to 3 months is a pretty good window to use that. If you're interested in quality, then I would be shopping for whole beans. I know it's annoying to own a coffee grinder, but a bag of whole beans costs the same as a bag of pre-ground coffee, and the pre-ground coffee is significantly worse value. It tastes worse, and it will taste worse and worse quite quickly after you open it. It may be sealed and it may be gas flushed potentially, but it is still degrading because it's ground. You've diced this thing up, smashed it to little pieces, exposed a lot of it to whatever atmosphere it's in. It's losing aromatics. It's staling. It's oxidizing. The chemistry is changing. That change happens much slower in coffee beans. And so if you like coffee, a coffee grinder is a wonderful thing. One, every morning smells amazing. That's nice. That's just a nice thing to have as part of your life. And two, you can grind it appropriately for how you're going to brew it. And three, buying beans just is better value. It's just you get more good flavor out of whole beans than you do out of pre-ground.
And if someone wanted to upgrade their coffee routine without going full on espresso machine and down that rabbit hole, would you say the first step would be maybe investing in a decent coffee grinder?
A good coffee grinder is an investment these days. I'm not going to lie. Like a good one, meaningfully good, especially if you want options in the future, might be £150,
okay.
Which I know is not cheap. You can spend 10 times that, 20 times that on a coffee grinder if you want to, but at that point you've got a grinder with a good motor, a good set of burrs that will last you a long time and grind a real range of sizes from incredibly fine to really coarse if you need that. I really like filter coffee. I think be it a pour over, be it a French press, anything like that produces a longer cup of black coffee, I think is very easy to do. You don't need specialist equipment. You can boil water in a kettle. You can have a little cone, or you can have a bunch of different brewers that are easy to use, flexible with coffee. But if you're grinding it yourself, you're going to have a much better experience. And so you don't need to spend a fortune. If you like filter coffee, you can be drinking as good a coffee as you could get in a cafe for £150, £180, including all the bits and pieces and a bag of coffee. So yes, it's a bit upfront, but at £3 a cup, 2 months in, you're kind of at parity with going to a coffee shop. And it's not really £3 a cup anymore. It's kind of 4. And so brewing at home, I think, is great value and kind of fun, but not that challenging if you like filter coffee. You can brew very easily with a bunch of different brewers that you don't have to care that much, and you can get some really good results.
Now, I know some friends of mine who sometimes keep their coffee in the fridge or even in the freezer. Is there any science behind that beyond just keeping it in a dark, cool, dry place?
Some at this point. The fridge isn't great, it seems. There's pretty limited benefits in the fridge. There's opportunity for cross-contamination of aroma as well. The freezer, though, definitely is useful. If you have some whole coffee beans and you put them in the freezer, ideally sealed, and if you're going to store it for a long time, a lot of bags will have a little valve on them. You see a little sort of circle and a hole in the middle. That's designed to let CO2 out of the bag as the coffee ages, because CO2 is a kind of byproduct of coffee roasting. If you tape over that seal, for various reasons, and put that in the freezer, 6 months will be fine.
Wow.
Now, that's really nice for things like decaf that you may not use all the time. And so, I know some people that will portion down like a cup at a time into little portions and just leave those in the freezer. And then, when you need it, pull it out. You can grind it from frozen just fine, and it will be really pretty fresh tasting. So the freezer is very useful for long-term storage. Pretty great. If you're drinking that coffee and you bought a bag and you're going to drink it over the next 2-3 weeks, don't worry about the freezer. But if you bought a couple of bags, or you bought in bulk because you're trying to save a little bit of money, you can parcel that down into sealed bags. You could use sandwich bags, you could use whatever you like, and then freeze that to keep it longer term, and then pull it out as you need and, let it defrost. It will start to age at normal speeds once it comes out of the freezer. But freezers are genuinely very useful for the long-term storage of coffee.
That's very interesting. I guess one more thing is, we've seen now the development of this artisanal coffee and specialty coffees and different ways in which people are consuming and growing coffee. And the price is becoming increasingly expensive as well as it becomes this premium luxury item. Do you think we could also be headed towards this worrying future where, because of climate change, it becomes even more luxury and even more premium because, we sort of lose a lot of these coffee farms as well?
I mean, yes. Simply, there's a few factors here that we should probably clear out first, in that if you go to a coffee shop, a relatively small piece of the price of a cup is the coffee. We've seen rapid rises in the price of a cup of coffee, especially in the last couple of years. This is primarily money that is going to labor in terms of, people are earning more money. Inflation has driven that up. And then sadly, so you feel about it, landlords have done very well out of most independent coffee shops, and a depressing portion of a cup of coffee goes to a landlord. And that seems unlikely to change anytime soon. And those are bigger pressures on a cafe in the short term, especially now with sort of changes in things like national insurance, something like that, rates, all those things. Those are big pressures on coffee shops. Coffee prices are, however, also going up. Climate change is very much impacting coffee and will continue to do so. We see it in a number of different ways. You see things like an increased incidence of certain kinds of diseases that affect coffee plants. One of them is called leaf rust, which is a sort of brownish fungus that attacks the leaves of coffee trees, causes the leaves to fall off, and then the plant can't breathe, and so the plant dies. In the short term, the plant will respond by dropping its fruit because it doesn't have the resources to maintain fruit. It's just trying to survive. So it's a very damaging disease within coffee, and your ability to protect your trees against it is made more difficult by changes in weather patterns and unpredictable rain, which is one of the impacts of climate change in most coffee-producing countries. That said, there's a bigger challenge. If we go back to what we talked about earlier on altitude, as temperatures increase, you kind of need to drive coffee up the mountain. It needs those cooler temperatures at night. And as climate change causes temperatures to go up, you need to sort of go up the mountain. The problem with mountains is that the higher you go up a mountain, the less mountain there is. And so if you look at most studies, the viable land for coffee production is shrinking in the future. So yes, there are other challenges too within coffee production. Primary one probably is labor. People don't want to work in coffee anymore. For pretty good reason. I think if you were 25 and you looked at what the previous, 3 generations of your family had gone through in coffee production, it would be hard to be like, this is what I want to do. There's urban flight everywhere. And I think that's a massive part of a change within most coffee growing countries. And so I think last year, Honduras, for example, its coffee production was about $165 million short on what it could have produced if it had enough labor. And so the trees were there. No one was there to maintain the trees, prune the trees, pick the fruit off them. So that's a pretty difficult one to change. The average age of a coffee producer in Colombia, I think now is like 58, 59. I think we've seen a graying of farmers around the world everywhere, I think for similar reasons. So yes, there's a lot of pressure, and there will be people who will continue to produce great coffee, and great coffee will continue to be available, but it will get more expensive, I think, and I don't see how that changes.
I think just like the chemical composition of coffee, there seems to be a lot of depth both in the health benefits of coffee, but also the cultural benefits of coffee, and generally the technology as well. And one thing that has been an urge of mine over the last hour of speaking to you is this desire now to get into the coffee game and maybe even get my own grinder. I mean, like I said, I'm not a big coffee guy now and then, but I do want to dabble now. You've really lit a passion for me just to maybe get a grinder, get some beans, and you just start, I want that morning smell. I want to be part of this coffee niche. So James, thank you so much for explaining so much about coffee in such a condensed time frame. And like I said, hopefully I can get a perfect cup of coffee with you some point in the future.
We'll sort you out. Thank you very much.
Thank you.